Hello, everybody. We're just going to give everyone a minute to join the webinar. While you're waiting for us to get started, go ahead and answer the poll question when you have a second. If you're just joining us, we're going to get started in just a minute. We're just going to wait for everybody to join. The numbers are still going up, and we'll get started in just a second, but feel free to answer the poll while you're waiting. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to end the poll and I'm going to share the results with all of you so you can see who is here. Looks like we've got a good mix of people from a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of survivor advocates, interested community members, some nonprofit attorneys, and then a few people from other professions as well. So we're so thrilled to have you all here today. I've been really looking forward to this training, and I hope you are too. My name is Jamie Beck, and I'm the President and Managing Attorney of Free to Thrive, and I will be moderating today's discussion and our Q&A. Just a quick note that all of you are muted. We can't see you. We do have the Q&A and chat function and the chat available. If you have any comments, you can put them in the chat, and you can put any questions that you have in the Q&A. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the webinar. We'll try and keep an eye on the Q&A and may answer questions as we go along, but we'll definitely save time at the end to answer any questions, but feel free to ask them as you go. And for anybody who's interested, the training will be recorded and will be sent to all attendees after the fact. So just a quick note on Free to Thrive, if you're not familiar with our organization, we empower human trafficking survivors by providing them with legal services and other support services. And we aim to increase access to justice for all survivors. And we're a Southern California-based organization. And I am beyond thrilled to introduce our speakers today. Really dynamic individuals who are doing incredible work in this space. And I've been fortunate to connect with both of them. And we've been working on this 3-part series for, I think, close to 6 months now. And I have learned so much from these 2 women about, illicit massage and about the impact of human trafficking on the API community. And I hope that you learned as much from them as I have already. So it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce our speakers, Yvonne Chen, who is the Director of Private Sector Engagement for ECPAT USA, and Amy Shea, who is the Deputy Director of the Anti-Trafficking Initiative at Sanctuary for Families. And they both have really extensive bios that will be included in your written materials. And I didn't want to take the time to read them just so that we have more time to hear from them. But you will see from their bios that they both are really experts in this field and have been doing work, particularly in the anti-trafficking space, for a very long time. So without further ado, I'll introduce our speakers and have them take it from here.
Thanks so much, Jamie. And I'm super excited to be here with you all today as well. As Jamie mentioned, I am Amy Shea. I'm from Sanctuary for Families, which is a New York City-based nonprofit organization that started off serving domestic violence survivors, but as we continue to work with our clients, came to understand that many of them have experienced many different forms of gender violence, including human trafficking. And so our goal is to support our clients to find safety, healing, and self-determination in coming out of whatever difficult times that they maybe are meeting us with initially.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yvonne Chen. I'm so thankful to be here to speak to everyone today. So I'm glad that everyone is joining and we're excited to kind of talk about this. So my name is Yvonne Chen. I am our Director of Private Sector Engagement at ECPAT USA. And ECPAT USA is a national organization. We're focused on protecting every child's human right to grow up free from the threat of sexual exploitation and trafficking. So we do this through a few different ways. We focus on policy and advocacy, private sector engagement, engaging with corporations and businesses around education and training. We do youth education as well as part of our prevention work and really talking to young people about the injustices that are happening and the issues that relate to them, as well as community education. So excited to be here and talk about our experiences today.
So I'm just going to walk through very briefly what we'll cover today. I know you're a very dynamic bunch, and so I'm looking forward to your questions and participation along the way. Just to kind of level set here, we'll start off by talking about what we mean by human trafficking. And then we'll begin to identify the different forms of trafficking that we may see in the Asian and Pacific Islander communities, which we'll just say API for short. We'll discuss some cultural considerations and the vulnerabilities that this particular community may face. We'll talk about some intersections of oppression and polyvictimization and how that affects our clients. We'll also talk about recruitment tactics that you might see in this community and discuss some survivor needs and services. And lastly, we can't have a Zoom conversation at this time without addressing the elephant in the room, COVID-19 and its impact on this particular community. So we have a lot to talk about, and why don't we just get right into it? And I love training with Yvonne because she knows me so well and likes to make fun of how nerdy I am. And so here we are. We're going to start off with a pop quiz. Don't worry, you're not going to be personally graded on it, but I'm just going to give you a few minutes to answer a couple of questions. The first, have you worked on trafficking issues and/or with trafficking survivors before? That's, you know the answer to that, but we would love to know. So I'll give you a few seconds to complete that. And we can see that the majority of you have. So I think, we won't spend too much time talking just defining human trafficking, since I think you're aware of it, but then we'll talk about it more specifically in the community that we're discussing today. The next question is, true or false? Victims travel across locations and may appear to have freedom of movement. So here we mean human trafficking victims. Human trafficking victims must travel across locations and may appear to have freedom of movement. True, that's right. Okay, I think I might be working with an expert group here, and so maybe you all have a lot to teach us, and I'm excited about that as well. Okay, another one. Victims never consent to providing sexual services. Human trafficking victims never consent to providing sexual services. True or false? Okay. Let's see what. And you all said false. Very exciting. Again, it seems like you're all experts in the room, but we'll get into this in detail. But it is clear consent is irrelevant. And finally, we have one last question. If given the chance, victims want to escape their trafficker. If given the chance, human trafficking victims want to escape their trafficker. True or false? Yes. So for this question, we mean 100% of the time, and the answer is false. Okay, but we got some people that said true, and so I think this is an interesting topic to discuss, and we'll get into it a little bit more. When I've done these trainings in person, I would just, show the answer. And one thing that I do mention, and if I don't remember to mention it later, we do find that some of our clients who are in human trafficking situations do not necessarily want to leave. And it could be for a variety of reasons. And one might be that there may be a traumatic bonding that happens between the individual and their trafficker. So we'll talk a little bit about that later today. But I just wanted to say that now in case I don't remember to say it later. So many of you are experts, and so I will briefly just go over the definition. Today, I am focusing on the federal definition. We know that there are many different definitions of human trafficking. There's an international one found in the Palermo Protocol, but today, since we have a national audience, and also because it is also relevant for state level work, we're going to talk about the definition found in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. Here we see sex trafficking means the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purposes of commercial sex act. And here we specifically highlight severe forms of trafficking in persons, because that's where you really get the definition of human trafficking, or like commonly used term of human trafficking. I won't read it specifically to you, but you'll see that 3 words that we often highlight in both the definition of sex trafficking and labor trafficking is the terms force, fraud, or coercion. And so what makes something a severe form of trafficking in persons is that there must be force, fraud, or coercion by the trafficker. And it's not any other colloquial definition of severe. So you don't have to see a particular kind of beating or a particular kind of coercion, but instead that you are that there's force, fraud, or coercion. And I apologize if there's a lot of background noise, but there's snow shoveling that's happening just outside my window. So let me know if you have trouble hearing me. One common way that we like to simplify all those words is to categorize it into action, means, and purpose. And so in the actions column, you'll see all of those phrases: induce, recruit, harbor, transport, provides, obtains, patronize, and solicit. The means: force, fraud, or coercion. And the purpose: commercial sex or labor. So one thing I want to highlight in the actions column is, particularly for patronizes or solicits, those particular words were added by the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act in 2015 that adds criminal liability for even buyers of commercial sex from a victim of trafficking. Another thing I wanted to point out is this concept of coercion. So force and fraud, I think, are pretty easy to understand, but coercion is a particularly defined term, and it's particularly important in the API community when we think about human trafficking. So I wanted to flag that. And finally, to the point about the polls earlier, you'll see that in this definition of a severe form of trafficking in persons, there's no particular requirement that transportation or border crossings have to happen, or that someone doesn't have freedom of movement, or that there's consent. None of those things are in that definition. And so you're all spot on when you said that those are not elements of human trafficking. So I wanted to point out the concept of coercion here. As I will just point out that it says here, threats of serious harm to physical or physical restraint against any person, or any scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause a person to believe that failure to perform an act would result in serious harm or physical restraint to any person, or the abuse or threatened abuse of legal process. And as we move forward in this discussion, you'll see a lot of the things that we talk about in terms of exploitation of vulnerabilities happens in this space of coercion for API survivors of trafficking. Next slide, please.
Great. So thanks, Amy, for going through those definitions. So we really are talking a lot about how we frame trafficking and how we understand trafficking. And oftentimes it presents itself in so many different ways that may not be clear to what we think or clear to what our images of what trafficking can look like or what our thoughts are. So we're going to go over the power and control wheel, which is something that is based on the Domestic Abuse Intervention Project's Duluth model. And this power and control wheel outlines the different types of abuse that can occur actually within labor and trafficking situations. So this was developed at Polaris. And so really thinking about power and control. So there's a few things that the traffickers have power and control over to the people that they're trafficking. So coercion and intimidation, if you see at top, are often overlap. And so it's really important to remember that coercion and threats are very real to the people who are in these situations. So just because I personally, as a service provider, may not understand what that is like, it's important to understand that these threats are very real. And the threats are actually, there are many threats that people follow through on. So intimidation, making people feel like they have no other choice but to stay in that situation. So emotional abuse and isolation, emotional abuse really thinking about humiliating in front of others, making sure that the victim feels that they've can go to no one else. They make the victim feel that they are guilty. And so really it's thinking about how, even if we don't see physical bruises and physical scars, which a lot of people do look for maybe in trafficking situations, it's really thinking about what is being said to make someone feel that they cannot leave otherwise. And so making the victim feel guilt is something we see so often, and really thinking about that. Isolation, really ensuring that someone is not able to tell anyone else. So ensuring that they isolate people and bringing them outside of their community, bringing them to a place where they may not speak the language. So there's different ways that isolation can really happen. There's a lot of denying, minimizing, and blaming, really thinking about when we encounter someone who might be experiencing exploitation or trauma, oftentimes we hope that once we offer help, this person will take the help. But oftentimes people are really in their situations and they may not be able to fully recognize at that point the help that they need, or they might not be able to fully recognize that they are in a certain situation, or they feel that they've been offered help before and nothing has really followed through in terms of helping them. So just really thinking about that. It doesn't mean that they are not experiencing anything if someone denies, but really just thinking about what circumstances they're in. Sexual abuse, we see this a lot, where people can use sexual abuse as a means of control and power, and this also goes into physical abuse. So just really thinking about ways that can essentially make the victim feel that they have no other options. Again, so really thinking about physical abuse in terms of even denying food and water, really making people feel dependent on drugs, for example. Sexual abuse, really making them feel that they are normalizes sexual violence and selling of sex in these scenarios. Using privilege is something we like to talk about. So really thinking about what that can look like for a person, and it varies. So for someone who maybe grew up with community, grew up with resources, and being able to seek help from those resources or that community, versus someone who did not grow up with community and did not grow up with resources. So that's even something. If we're looking at people who speak different languages and English is not their first language, then meeting someone who speaks English and a trafficker who can speak English, it has power and control over the victim. So really thinking about some of those things in terms of using privilege. And economic abuse, a lot of times our clients are not able to fully control their money, or when people are able to receive money, then they're usually paying back some sort of debt that has a large overarching number with interest. And so just really thinking about all of the different ways that traffickers can have power and control over the people that they are victimizing. So in trafficking. So really thinking about the different ways. Next slide.
And I just would
Yeah.
add that the reason why I like to think about the power and control wheel in this particular community is because the dynamics of coercion come out through how traffickers use these like different slices of the power and control pie here to coerce our clients into commercial sex or labor. So we'll come back to this again later too.
Great, thanks. So labor trafficking affecting API communities. So there's a variety of different ways. So domestic servitude is one. Definitely worked with clients who have either been brought abroad from visa agencies, for example, or working for diplomats, or coming here into the US to be with family or whatnot, and they end up being trafficked here with opportunities of a job. So domestic servitude happens. Nail salons, if we think about a few years ago, the New York Times had a expose on nail salons and the treatment of workers there at nail salons. So really that can also be a way of trafficking people as well. Restaurant workers. So if we think often about cheap labor, if we think often about things like that, there's definitely exploitation, and exploitation can also lead into trafficking. So we've seen areas of that. Farm workers. So we really think about this in terms of even cheap produce and things like that, really thinking about where our food comes from, where the source of some of these services come from as well. So the farm workers, for example, there was these, the Thai farm workers that were trafficked in the US. There was a case in the early 2000s, and there were about 400, I believe, Thai farm workers that were being exploited here in the United States and were being trafficked into the US. So just some of the things that we think about that we don't necessarily maybe have ever connected the dots, but labor trafficking in these ways. Fisheries, we've definitely heard of cases of that where really people are exporting labor or using people for labor exploitation and labor trafficking in these ways. So it's important just to kind of think about where we get our services and where we get our food, and really thinking about how those are some ways that have trafficking in them. Next slide. So these are some of the examples that we've seen in terms of sex trafficking affecting API communities. So I would like to state that these are also not all inclusive. These are just some of the things that we have seen before in the ways that we have seen trafficking affect the community. So for sex trafficking, illicit massage businesses or a commercial commercial front brothel. So this is something that our series will be talking about further in depth in today, but also the next two series as well. So oftentimes there's a very specific model and trend that we've seen in that residential brothels. So even in light of safety reasons, in light of COVID for physical safety, but also just residential brothels have always existed. So that's something. We've also seen host bars and karaoke bars as an example. For those who do not know what host bars are, sometimes there are these bars and where you can go in and have a drink with typically a female, and they would be technically called the host, and they would be able to spend time with you, and it can escalate into sexual services. Karaoke bars, we've definitely seen that as well, as a front for a brothel situation or some sort of trafficking scheme. So these are just some of the ways that we have seen sex trafficking affect the API community.
So we highlight this slide here just to talk about how sex trafficking and labor trafficking can occur in a lot of these common settings. And so just first to point out that though we highlight homes, factories, hotels, restaurants, or massage businesses, like all of these places, many of these places can be legitimate businesses. And so even though we're listing them here, we're not saying that these places automatically have human trafficking happening in them. But even from there, as places where people work, it can be a place where labor exploitation happens. And labor exploitation is merely a situation where an employer takes advantage of an employee in an unfair work setting. And the labor situation can escalate to become a labor violation, where we're then looking at laws federally, at the state level, at the municipal level, where specific laws are violated, labor laws are violated. So for example, wage and hour laws violated. So that's something that we might call labor violation. But from there, you can have an even more specific situation where there is force, fraud, or coercion into labor or commercial sex that then causes that situation become sex or labor trafficking. And we depict it in this way because particularly in the center where you see clubs, bars, massage businesses, sexually oriented businesses, small businesses, you can see sex trafficking happening or labor trafficking or potentially labor trafficking with sexual exploitation. So as an example, I had a client who was working at a factory, and I see it's in the labor column, but the employer was labor trafficking this individual by going above and beyond just labor violations of not paying what they had agreed, but basically gradually taking away this person's freedom and dignity and forcing them to work obscene hours with little to no pay and beginning to kind of violate the person and humiliate the person. And there was also a sexual exploitation portion of it where that individual had been subjected to or kind of forced to engage in sex acts with the employer that maybe can be deemed sexual harassment, but in this case he wasn't being offered to someone else for a commercial sex act, and so for that reason we would consider that to be sexual exploitation in a labor trafficking context. But so this slide is just to point out that you can have a lot of different versions of a lot of different combinations of sex trafficking or labor trafficking happening in many different settings. Yeah. Next slide, please. So at this point, we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the cultural considerations amongst the API community. So here we just have a couple of bullets, but these are very, very massive cultural statements and concepts. And so I will try my best to elaborate on them, but I should just say that probably many of you on the call, and I'm sure the broader API community has a lot more to say about each of these things. But the first I wanted to highlight was this concept of filial duties. And so particularly for the East Asian countries that are rooted in kind of Confucian principles of relationships, there are these duties that one owes to people that they're in relationship with. So their parents, their siblings, their teachers, elders, employers, to their children, right? So there are these particular duties that one has based on their relationship to other people. And so this is an important piece because it comes into play when, say, an employee is relating to someone who they view as their employer. And I also see that there are some hands that are being raised. And so if you want, you can type your question into the chat and we can discuss, we can answer those questions as they appear. And maybe we will, yeah. So I think maybe Jamie will highlight them as we're going through each section. Another concept is this concept of being community oriented. And so particularly because it's a very relational society, one is not just owing duties to their immediate family, like their children or their parents, but there's also one's relationship to their broader community that is very important and at stake whenever they're engaging with each other. So I kind of highlight that also because if a person were to do something, it isn't just a representative of themselves and what they're able to do, or a representative of themselves and their family, but potentially their broader community. And I think also coming to the States, where often people from the Asian Pacific Islander community are viewed as a particular group, even if there are so many different subgroups, there is this concept that what you're doing can reflect on your entire community, your entire ethnicity. This whole concept of self-sufficiency is also very important. It is a really highly regarded value where if you can make it for yourself and make it work for yourself and not be a bother to other people, that is the ideal. Not to go out and look for help from other people, not to seek public benefits, not to basically trouble other people to do something for you. This is an important value that members of the API community hold. And because of that, there's this also kind of other concept, our partner concept, which is this idea of eating bitterness, where you can endure hardships and struggles, and at the end of it, there will be some kind of reward instead. And finally, this whole concept of saving face. It is, I think we think of it as like not airing one's dirty laundry, but it's also just this broader concept of representing so many more people, being from this broader community network. It's very important not to look bad on behalf of everyone. And so, like, for example, right now I'm presenting and Jamie hyped me up as this like expert, and it's very important for me not to let her down, but also not to let my broader community, not to let Sanctuary for Families down, not to let my whole family down if I don't present, expert level information to you all. So hopefully you will let me know that when you fill out the evaluation at the very end. Next slide, please. So another important aspect is that a lot of people coming from an API background, particularly if they're immigrants, and so we're not talking about Asian Americans or API who have grown up in the US, but we're talking about folks who are having come from another background, from another country. And so I'll just use China as an example. Each individual is coming from a different legal and policy context. And so in China, it's an authoritarian government, it's not a democratic government. And so there are, the way one relates with their government is going to be different. It's not, their voice is not specifically going to be reflected in some kind of vote, let's say. And there are different policies that can be passed, such as the coercive population control policy in China, where previously each family was only allowed to have one child with some minor exceptions. And I think as of 2015 or at the end of 2015, each family could have 2 children. But having that kind of limitation can impact an entire society. It has impacted an entire society, and I can tell you from the experiences of my clients, it's impacted them very personally. And so having come from that kind of background, they'll view their relationship with government and what government can be doing for them here in the US very differently than our understanding of government. I highlight domestic violence here just to say that it's kind of a different situation. Sure, in the US, we've seen some progressive changes in how we treat domestic violence, but in China, yes, again, as an example, it is a very much normalized situation that can happen and is for the longest time something to have been dealt with in the home by a family at home, and not in the courts, and not with the help of government. And so similarly, when you think about other crimes or certain kinds of petty crime, what might be seen as petty crimes, people coming from API backgrounds may have a different relationship with government and thinking about how government can be helpful in addressing some of these things. In China, again, as an example, sex trafficking as a concept is not per this federal definition that we just went through, but their kind of common view of what is trafficking are people coming from Southeast Asia, sometimes male children. And so each person that you might be encountering from an API background may just have a different understanding of what human trafficking is and may not identify their own situation as meeting some kind of definition here in the US. And finally, mental health care as a concept is frequently stigmatized in the API community. And so when we think about working through trauma, and trauma that may be the result of trafficking or trauma as a result of other kinds of abuse, it isn't normal to seek mental health care. In fact, it's completely seen as an individual illness that someone might have. And so frequently when we encounter clients who are very much negatively affected by the trauma that they experienced, we will have a much harder time working through or kind of talking through the potential benefits of mental health care. And so these are just some kind of cultural background that I think we should keep in mind. And then one last thing is that in other countries, the whole concept of nonprofits might not really exist. And so organizations like Sanctuary for Families, Free to Thrive, ECPAT, they might not really understand what the purpose is and might really think of us as being an arm of the government, depending on what kind of cultural background they're coming from.
Yeah, and we're giving context to this, so it's just important to think about the different layers that are coming with people who are in the API community. So someone had asked about, please give examples of Southeast Asia. So while there are people in the community in Southeast Asia who there is also a stigma on mental health, I would say there's also a similarity in keeping things within the community and keeping things within the family. And I think one of the things that we mentioned as well, but didn't maybe flesh out thoroughly, is about being a burden on others. And so part of the self-sufficiency piece is really thinking about not being a burden on other people. So while it can be something as minimal in our minds as maybe for someone who's asking for water. So if I offer someone some water, say I just come in, the client comes in, they sit down, and I say, do you want something to drink? They'll say no. And they'll, in a typical mindset, in a Western mindset, I'd be like, okay, cool, they don't want it. But culturally speaking, I know that I would probably ask them 3 times. And then on the 3rd time, they may respond and say they do want some water. They would like some. And it's really on the basic level, they feel like if I'm not holding water for myself, they feel that they are burdening me and that I'm going out of my way to do that for them. And so I know that we had given a lot of explanation or examples of China, but I think similarly to nonprofits, I think nonprofits in Southeast Asia also exist, but it may not be clear as to who the nonprofit is. There's also a lot of international nonprofits that come in to these spaces, specifically in Southeast Asia, but a lot of times the locals have not had good experiences there. So who to trust is even something already like that. So I think that's something that we want to think about. So along with all of the cultural nuances that we're thinking about, vulnerabilities, what are some other vulnerabilities that exist? So debt, a lot of times people do have debt in terms of owing money to someone or paying for medical bills if there's a sick family member, schooling. Schooling costs money for people, so borrowing money to pay for school, debt in borrowing money maybe to come here to the US. There is a large debt that sometimes is incurred when paying a travel agency or for the flight or for arranging a visa. Limited English proficiency. So just really thinking about how I often give this example of, I think if I were dropped off in a country, or if I arrived in a country and I did not know the language at all, none of the characters made sense to me, no one spoke my language, and I just did not know what was happening around me necessarily. And I meet someone who speaks a language that's similar to mine, or they're from my hometown, we bond over that. And I already have some automatic trust for this person because I can communicate with them. So limited English proficiency in the United States is a vulnerability that we see a lot of times. Little to no community, a lot of times we see them coming here into the US as providers for their family. And so oftentimes they are really bringing themselves here so that they can provide for their families. So oftentimes when they bring themselves here, they don't have community and they have to start over again in terms of community. So that's a vulnerability that we've seen as well. A lot of people have a lack of knowledge of US systems. I think that it's important to remember that people assume that people have an understanding about US systems, from the criminal legal system, if someone has been arrested, to even something like Amy said, nonprofits. What are nonprofits? How are they different from the government? What does that really mean? And what does it look like? And how do they know who to trust if there is a lack of US systems? So even thinking about the healthcare system, which is very complicated, even for someone like myself who has been grown up here and educated here, and the US healthcare system is also sometimes confusing to me. So just really thinking about how some of these layers can really add to the vulnerabilities. So we want to just touch upon kind of this polyvictimization, which some of you may or may not know. So polyvictimization refers to the experience of multiple layers of victimization, such as things like sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, bullying, exposure to family violence, versus many episodes of the same kind of victimization. So we want to talk about the intersections of oppression and polyvictimization, because I think this is something that if I may not be thinking about, if I just meet someone straight on, I may not fully understand the things that they're going through, or I may not fully understand exactly where they're coming from. Or as service providers, I know that there was a lot of service providers here. You may have been frustrated with working with people who you just didn't seem to really connect with, or you felt like they were being resistant in a way, which I think sometimes can be natural feelings. And so when we're thinking about oppression, we're thinking about what are things like racism. So what are some fears? So specifically, we're talking about the API community. There has been and I'm really sorry, there are some sirens because I am in New York City, so I apologize for that. But what are some of the things like racism, for example, currently happening? There is an increase in physical assaults of API community members and elders. And the elders are very respected in our community. And so if there are physical assaults, how likely is someone able to feel that they can go talk to someone and seek help? And I think an example of this I can remember, or I think to kind of frame it, is there was a grandma who was physically assaulted, and she is physically okay now, but someone had tried to light her on fire in Brooklyn, in New York. And actually on that day, she decided to not tell her family because she didn't want them to worry. And so there's many pieces to that. There's racism, there is the burdening, that she didn't want to worry her family and she didn't want to burden them. And so I think it's just really kind of framing that. So sexism, misogyny, classism also has effect. Language accessibility. A lot of times language is really not accessible to people. If we think about language access, if we think about if people can read, if people can speak the language, if they have an education level that did not allow them to read on a university level, for example, like what is the language that we're using and how are we speaking about these things? Immigration status. If you are currently seeking immigration status, then it's pretty hard for you to get a job or to feel that you can seek for help, even though each state is very different in its laws on helping people who are undocumented or currently seeking status. So there's a few different things. We're talking about polyvictimization, the different abuses that you see here on the left: sexual, physical, emotional, neglect, family, racial. So it's just really thinking about when someone comes to you, they're bringing so many different experiences and so many different identities with them. And so oftentimes it may not present that way. When someone comes to me, they don't say, I'm a victim of trafficking. They're talking about maybe what their needs are. And similar to people who come to social service providers, maybe they're looking for food, maybe they're looking for employment, but what are some of the experiences when we're talking to them have happened to them before or are currently happening to them? So while we talk about the API community, we really want to emphasize that it is not a monolith. So when people have the umbrella of Asian Pacific Islander and also Asian American Pacific Islander, Asia is a very large continent with so many different countries in itself, so many different cultures and so many different ethnicities. So it's really important to kind of think about that, and emphasize that it's not maybe what we're used to if we're not from the culture, to understand that Asian Pacific Islanders are not a monolith. So everyone has different experiences, but the things that we're talking about today are some of the trends we've seen, some of the cultural nuances that we've been able to see across multiple layers of different groups of people. So also, we really want to ensure that we're not having our biases play out in the way. So racism plays a big part, specifically assuming that there are, for example, Asian women who want to be fetishized, want to provide sexual services. So this actually happened a lot in some of the clients that I've worked with who were working in massage businesses, and there were customers who went in assuming that they wanted to provide sexual services to them, and this can be due to the impact of Hollywood and the porn industry only having certain roles for API women. Typically, really thinking about the exoticization of API communities. So it's just really thinking about how that can play a role. So someone going in automatically assuming has ended up assaulting clients and raping clients for that. So it's just really important to kind of keep a lens on that. Language. What languages do we use? So, in this space, I've heard a lot of generalizations, and we want to be very careful about not making blanket generalizations. So oftentimes, now people think about what is an automatic thing that people think about when we say massage parlors. I've asked this question, and oftentimes people think Asian massage parlors, but again, massage businesses are not always Asian. While there are many that are run by Asian people or have Asian masseuses or Asian Pacific Islander masseuses, but it's just kind of really thinking about what language we're using and really ensuring that we're not creating these biases that unintentionally harm people. Yeah, go to the next one.
So with all of that background in mind, we wanted to touch briefly on recruitment tactics. And this doesn't represent the whole of human trafficking in the API community, but just as it relates to some of these cultural considerations and specific vulnerabilities. We see that traffickers are exploiting particular vulnerabilities such as financial instability, coming here as an immigrant. And that might happen really in any kind of immigrant community. But we frequently see in our clients false promises of work or false promises of a particular work condition or the amount of pay. And sometimes increasing physical isolation for our clients. And so, for example, they might be recruited for a job, but the job then is many, many miles outside of the closest city where there is a small community that speaks their language. And so our client ends up being alone in a location where there's not easy access to public transportation or anyone that can help them understand, like, how do things work in this community? And so that is one key piece that gets our clients in a situation of human trafficking. We also hear from our clients that they're told by traffickers not to trust service providers, not to trust nonprofit organizations, especially free ones. And we frequently hear like, oh, it's better if you pay for the service, because if you pay, then you know you're getting something of good quality. And especially if you're coming from a place where there's no concept of of nonprofit services, then certainly the paid one must be better. And so we hear that from a lot of our clients. And so sometimes they'll end up paying for a criminal defense attorney from the community that charges like thousands of dollars, but doesn't really have an understanding of how their kind of case is dealt with. In New York, we have a human trafficking intervention court, and the public defenders are fantastic and absolute experts in these kinds of cases. But oftentimes I see that our clients will end up paying for private attorneys that don't understand, or maybe even are hired by their traffickers to defend them. Our clients often hear that they shouldn't come in contact with systems such as the legal system or like the public benefits system, because all of these kinds of contacts with government could lead to deportation. And so these are basically lies that our clients often hear to are often told by traffickers to kind of keep them further isolated and under the control of their particular employer trafficker. We also hear all too commonly that our clients are being referred to immigration attorneys to help them to prepare exaggerated or fraudulent asylum claims. And this is a particularly frustrating thing for me, since my job is to help them to identify if they are eligible for immigration relief or civil legal remedies. But oftentimes we see their cases are complicated by previously filed asylum applications, and oftentimes not even by an attorney, and not prepped, and not, our clients are not fully informed about what they're filing for. And that can lead to very drastic immigration legal consequences for them, especially if they're found to have filed a fraudulent application that can bar them from seeking any kind of remedy in the future. And so these are just a few tactics that we see our clients have experienced. And we'll definitely go into more detail about trafficking recruitment patterns in illicit massage businesses in part 2 of this training series. So I just wanted to highlight briefly what are some of the needs that our clients are coming to us with. And I don't think these are very different from any other survivor of human trafficking that you may have encountered. Oftentimes they'll need shelter or housing, particularly those exploited in illicit massage businesses. Frequently are staying at their place of work and don't have a permanent home to go to or return to. So housing is often a concern. Case management is another huge concern, since they may need many different kinds of supportive services, and having someone to help them navigate through those different systems are important. Economic empowerment is another big piece. One of the major ways that traffickers exploit our clients is by letting them know that the only job they can get hired for as an undocumented immigrant of this background is basically restaurant work or nail salon, and illicit massage business work, or they'll just say massage work. But that's certainly not true. And oftentimes our clients are coming to us having some experience doing something, because they must have been able to support themselves so that they can make it across the ocean to this country. And so they certainly have skill sets that may be built upon. And so we're seeking to get them connected to skills training or kind of job placement programs. Our clients always need trauma-informed services, because after having gone through what they've been through, whether they want to call it a trauma or not, certainly affects them. And so we're looking to get them connected with different kinds of providers that have an understanding of how that may impact how our clients are presenting, which it might be potentially irritable, not wanting to engage in services, or potentially just kind of very much needing their services all the time. And we want to get our clients connected to folks that know how to respect where our clients are coming from and what they've been through, and work with them to overcome them. My portion is the legal representation piece, and our clients can need help from immigration support to family law support, different kinds of civil remedies, potentially criminal defense and post-conviction remedies. And so that's another area that we are trying to get them connected to. Certainly medical services and plenty of others. And I think the particular needs of those coming from the API community is that oftentimes there aren't a lot of providers in the API community that fully or frequently work with human trafficking survivors. And so I hope that many of you in this room are hoping to expand your service provision to this population. And we can talk more about what those specific needs are kind of after this part of the training series. Anytime along the way, our information will be available at the very end. But to think more about how you can tailor the services you already provide for trafficking survivors. And if you're a trafficking survivor-oriented organization but don't serve an API community, we can certainly provide a lot more information about how to work with this specific community as well. And you'll learn more throughout this series. Next slide, please.
Great. So we have covered a lot in a very short amount of time. But, I think part of what Amy and I, our goal is really just to be able to share with people some of the things to really think about. And it's important to remember that a lot of times the people that we've worked with, specifically in the API community, are really thoughtful about practical needs. And this is a lot of times for people who are acting in survival mode as well. So really ensuring that if I offer someone help, then what does it look like what does help look like? What are their needs? If I'm telling them to leave an unsafe situation, then is there housing there? Is there food? Is there childcare? Is there financial assistance? So kind of some of the things that Amy was mentioning, all the different types of services that are needed oftentimes are so connected. And oftentimes a lot of clients and survivors need multiple services. And so it's important to really think about how collaboration is a big piece of this, and really to ensure that we are working together, because we really want to ensure that we're having the best processes and the best ways to do less harm for people. So one of the ways that we're thinking about is, Amy had mentioned kind of economic opportunity, and someone in the Q&A had also asked kind of about what reforms can be put in place to ensure that avenues that law enforcement use to coerce and abuse workers in the commercial sex and massage trade. So we can definitely talk about that further, but I think there are some of the things that we can think about is, what does it look like to look more largely at an entity, at a trafficking entity, putting resources into investigating systems. We mentioned a bunch of other systems, but also all the different ways that people are exploited, which we'll talk about further in our second and third series. But really thinking about that, really thinking about how are we making it easier for people to make a living wage? Because actually it's very hard for a lot of people to make a living wage. So minimum wage is not living wage. So really thinking about those aspects. So like Amy mentioned, we do want to talk about the global pandemic that has really created a lot of vulnerabilities for people, and really increased vulnerabilities. So we really want to think through amplifying some of these things. So what are some of the ways that people have increased vulnerabilities and exploitation? Health risks. So there are people who are not able to go out maybe to seek services. So even going to something like a food pantry, or even something, if they have a immunocompromised person that they're taking care of, if they have children, if they themselves are immunocompromised, are they able to step out and seek something for basic necessities? So thinking about that, unemployment or employment insecurity. So there have been many jobs that have been affected, and this includes people with salaried jobs. And so really thinking about, for people who have salary jobs, but then thinking about people who have been living paycheck to paycheck a lot of times without a salary, what does that look like for them? Homelessness and housing insecurity. A lot of people have not been able to pay rent because of unemployment, because of maybe health risks, people who have experienced COVID during this time, really thinking about that. Isolation, so decreased interaction to social services. A lot of times people are alone, and oftentimes, I've heard kind of a comparison of, well, home is, at least people have homes, but let's remember that not everyone has a home, and not everyone's home or the place that they live in, an apartment or a house, or where they the space where they're sleeping, is safe for them. And so really thinking about the added layers that of COVID that have really impacted trafficking. And when we're talking about trafficking, we're really talking about vulnerabilities that people exploit, and traffickers exploit vulnerabilities, and everyone has them. And so really thinking about what vulnerabilities have been amplified and have been really increasing in this time. So all that to say, traffickers are often thinking ahead, and they are often thinking about the ways that they can exploit people and make money off of people. So it changes to trafficking models. Where is the trafficking going? Are people moving less out of storefronts that are more visible and can be fined for opening? And are they moving into, we've heard stories of people moving into residential brothels, which I've definitely seen exist throughout the entire time. So just kind of thinking about the ways of how we can adapt some of the services in light of COVID, but also just thinking about how we can increase increase addressing these vulnerabilities, such as food, and such as how are we getting groceries to people? If people are immunocompromised, how are we able to ensure there's physical safety? Because not everyone has the resources or the community if they do get sick with COVID. So just kind of thinking about these things are added layers into our current circumstance. Yeah, and we are going into the next slide, please.
And I think before hopping to the end, just wanted to briefly touch on a couple of questions that were coming through. So I think I typed the answer into the chat, but someone was talking about, how to prevent law enforcement abusing their law enforcement privileges and kind of coercing sexual services from people in massage settings. And I don't know, Yvonne, if you agree, but I think one thing that I see, because that also has happened in New York City as well. And it's happened in the context where the investigation targets the person working in the massage business and is looking to arrest those individuals and charging them with prostitution. And it's not a human trafficking investigation. It's not targeting the broader operation of where employers are traffickers and are exploiting people. And beyond exploiting people, they are trafficking people, right? And so I think if that model was flipped and the focus was more on shutting down the trafficking operation to really investigate that, then perhaps that power to abuse like kind of lower level, like getting sexual services in lieu of getting, I guess, tips of raids, like I think that would hopefully go away. But also, I mean, there is a lot to be done, I think, in law enforcement. And I think our very last panel will focus on survivor-informed investigation tactics. And so I would very much encourage those of you who are interested in that topic to come back definitely for the third of this series. And I think someone else asked a question about the differences between Korean trafficking, or trafficking in Korean IMBs or Chinese labor. And so I can only speak to what I've seen, and I don't have a hypothesis as to why it's different, but more of our Korean speaking clients are trafficked in kind of hostess bar, karaoke bar, or brothel, residential brothel settings. And more of my Chinese clients, survivors of trafficking, were in commercial front massage business settings where commercial sex was being coerced.
Yeah, I would say there are, so kind of speaking about like law enforcement, I think it's, again, Ness, please join our third panel as we really will be expanding on it, but it is really thinking about what are survivor-informed ways to think about this. And one of the things that we'll talk about in our second series is all the different ways of exploitation that are happening. So we talked about poly-victimization. I think that this community is often being scammed and exploited in multiple ways, and how those multiple ways really add to more and more vulnerability. So what does it look like to think about survivors instead of really are putting resources into investigating, because I think one of the things that we have not emphasized enough is arrests are really traumatic for this community. If we're looking at the cultural nuances of shame and saving face, the arrest itself is very, very traumatic, and it can often be a really big barrier in terms of gaining trust. And so once that happens, whether or not you are with them when it happens, or whether or not you have seen them being arrested, but the fact that they have been at some point, even coming to me as a service provider, already presents a big challenge in gaining trust and really helping them understand how our systems work here, and what does it mean to have been arrested? What does it mean to have stayed in jail for a night? What does it mean? Does everyone know, is a question that people ask. Does everyone know that this happened to me? How is it going to go back to my family? How is this going to affect the community that I'm from? So I think that's kind of one of the things that we'll talk about more, and in terms of the differences, cultural nuances for different behaviors. I mean, I think part of it is some of the cultural understandings, I would say, are similar in terms of self-sufficiency, in terms of really thinking about saving face and being community oriented. I often say a lot of clients that I have seen, for example, if we're looking at domestic workers and domestic servitude in the Filipino community, they are resilient caretakers. They are taking care of their families. They have often come here because they've heard that they would be able to provide better for their families. So I think some of the things kind of play out maybe in different trafficking trends, but I do think the cultural nuances and the cultural ways and the context to think about it are pretty similar. They just might present in different trafficking trends. If we could go back.
Before we get in, oh, I'm sorry,
Oh no, I was gonna say if we could go back to the key takeaways.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh no, you can go ahead too. We just wanted to cover that after.
Oh yeah, no, go ahead and finish. I was just,
So just,
is there anything else on the key takeaways?
Yeah, no, I think just we summarized it here because I think we shared just a lot of seemingly disparate pieces of information. And I want to say that it all does come together, and hopefully you will participate in all three parts of the series. But we just wanted to point out that there are many different scenarios where people from the API community may actually have experiences that meet that legal definition of trafficking. And they may not seek services and help because of that cultural background or particular vulnerabilities that they kind of come with. A lot of our clients have experienced many different forms of oppression, many different forms of victimization. And so that definitely can affect the way people kind of come forward to look for help or don't. And so I think that's something to keep in mind when, as a helper, you want to make that connection, but it may rely on a huge amount of trust building before that can happen. And so I appreciate all of your efforts to show up today, because I know that you're already taking that proactive effort to understand the API community and how human trafficking can affect this community, and think through how to appropriately offer services for this group of people. So just really thank you for showing up.
Yeah. And definitely people should definitely feel free to reach out to us. But it's just kind of an understanding, and I think since many of your social service providers, I completely understand of when you feel overwhelmed and feel like we are another thing that we're looking for, and another kind of trend or another scenario or another exploitation or abuse. And I think what I really want to encourage people is for people who are interested in this topic, but also really thinking about serving this population, especially for social service providers, you're already looking at some of the things that are happening. It's just really more another lens to look at it, or another added layer of thinking about the exploitation that someone, or the trafficking that someone is experiencing. So for someone who, if you have a food pantry, there are ways that people maybe have conversations and can get a better understanding of where someone is, what's the context in that situation for someone coming in for domestic violence. So, if someone's coming in for domestic violence, oftentimes we've seen that there is, at some point, a lot of people have had trafficking in their past time as well. So, or they're currently in a trafficking situation, but oftentimes they might come in for something different, or they come in to Amy for immigration legal services, and Amy is asking them questions about to see what kind of relief they can have. And then it comes that you can see maybe there's trafficking in their home country, but there's also trafficking in the US. So I think some of it is just kind of an added layer. We'd love to really help you think through that. Yeah. And someone had asked about, in terms of connecting with homeless neighbors and also recognizing trafficking. So that's just kind of wanted to touch upon, like, some of these things you're already looking for. But I would say kind of when we're offering services, it's important to think about how, I like to say we need to put our ego aside. A lot of people have been harmed. A lot of people have had their trust taken advantage of, and a lot of people have been exploited. So just because I offer some help does not mean that they're going to take it, because they don't know me. They have no idea who I am. They only hear who I say I am, and that I care, or that I work for X, Y, and Z. So part of that is just really thinking about, we can offer these things, but we really want to ensure that some people have not had good experiences with some of these services. So it takes time and it takes consistent outreach, I think, to think through that. Yeah. Jamie, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I just wanted to, you guys have, thank you so much. This is absolutely phenomenal. And I do want to open it up to questions. If you have, I know people are already asking questions and you both are already answering them, but if you have questions that you haven't had a chance to ask, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A. And while you're typing those questions, you both have mentioned the other two parts in this 3-part series. So I want to make sure to highlight those, that the next training will really focus on helping service providers have a survivor-centered approach to serving those involved in illicit massage. There are a lot of nuances and unique aspects that you both have touched on today that we're going to take a much deeper dive into with our speakers at our next part. And then the last one will really be geared towards law enforcement and prosecution. Certainly anybody who's interested should attend. Those of you maybe in the service provider field, I encourage you to send this out to the law enforcement and prosecution individuals that you work with, and encourage them to come to that last one, because it's really geared towards them. We have a phenomenal panel that will involve somebody from law enforcement, somebody from prosecution, and somebody who consults with law enforcement and prosecution. So we'll be publicizing all the speakers very soon, but hope you'll attend those. And I think when you registered for this, I think it automatically registered you for all 3, but feel free to invite others who maybe didn't have a chance to attend today. And then I also want to share that we do have another training coming up next week that is on the intersection of trauma and addiction. And for those of us in the HT space, this is something that we work with every single day of that intersection. Excuse me, and a lot of trainings will maybe touch on it. This is going to take a much deeper dive. We have some experts from the University of San Diego that are really going to dive into that intersection. So that's next Thursday at 12 p.m. So I hope you'll join us for that as well. The information's on our website at freetothrive.org. And here's the link to actually the training page. But if you go to freetothrive.org, and then there's a section for trainings, you can find them all there. And then here are all of our contact information. If you want to reach out to any of us, I'm going to keep it here for just a second, and then I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see all of your questions in the Q&A, which I unfortunately can't see while I'm sharing my screen. So if you did not get a chance to copy that real quickly, go ahead and reach out to us or ask in the chat, and we'll type in our information. But looks like that was a comment, not a question. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions. You can put them into the Q&A. I'm just going to make sure that there's not any questions in the chat. I think there's mostly comments, but thank you all for being so active in here.
Yeah, and someone asked about South Asian victims being trafficked. So, I had mentioned farm workers before, but Amy also mentioned forced marriage, and forced marriage also can go into labor trafficking. I've had people who've been trafficked in domestic servitude as well. And there are other things like organ trafficking, maybe in other scenarios, but those are just some of the things that we have seen are like the forced marriage, farm workers. I would also say nail salons and things like that, as well as maybe some residential brothels. But those are some of the things that we've seen. And again, it's not to say that always happens, or those are the only avenues where it happens. And I think also because providing the trends that we do see also have to do with language capacity. So I do not speak any Southeast Asian languages. So that also might be why the trends that we have seen are a little different, because I speak Mandarin, so I've seen more East Asian clients.
One question that I had for both of you is something we've talked about previously, but I'm hoping you could share with the group is we talk about the need for language translation. And, one of the things that I've learned from both of you is that not all translators are the right translators for this client population. I'm sure we'll talk about this in the next training too, but I'd love you both to touch on what it is that service providers and law enforcement should be looking for in a translator, and what are the things to look out for that maybe you don't want in a translator?
I think that my answer is going to be very similar across kind of all immigrant communities. Is at least when you're working with the translator, you want to make sure that the person is doing word for word translation and is not just summarizing what's being said, because these details are very important to kind of figure out if there are elements of trafficking in there, because that definition is very long, and the whole concept of coercion, it's like one word in that definition, but can encompass so many different ways that can play out. Hearing the details of a story is very important. So at a minimum, working with a translator that can do word for word translation, but also separately, I think ideally it would be someone who has worked with this population before, or can gain a fluency in speaking the language of this population. I think one key way that we earn trust for our clients is to show them that what they're telling us is not new and scandalizing information, but like I've heard, unfortunately, their story many times before from someone else. I've learned the euphemisms and like the slogan, the jargon that is used in the community. And so hopefully the kinds of interpreters that you're working with can gain that kind of level of fluency as well.
Yeah, and I think also sometimes, even if you don't speak the language, you may not understand exactly what the translator is saying. I think it's really just important to look at body movements of the translator, but also the person that they are interpreting for. So a lot of times I have seen, unfortunately, not so great interpreters who were pretty aggressive with some of the things that they were saying. And even if I could not fully understand, I could see that the client was very uncomfortable. And it just has such a huge significance and impact, I would say, on how we work with people. So I know that oftentimes people may not have language accessibility and can only use something like an interpretation program on the fly on the phone, or I've also heard people use Google Translate. I just think that if possible, we trying to do that in a different way to make sure that there's trauma-informed ways to do it. But again, I would say, please feel free to reach out to Amy and I. We're more than happy to really think about what this can look like, because I also did not know a lot of the slang, I would say, that was used. I only learned it really in this. But also just being more sensitive and trauma-informed in a way is already helpful in terms of interpretation.
Yeah, and I think Valerie's point about knowing different dialects is important. There are, even within just the country of China alone, there are so many different dialects, and Mandarin is just kind of the national dialect that everyone is required to speak, but not everybody is able to speak that. And I think just to add another, kind of thinking back to all this cultural considerations that we've talked about, there are certainly people who are linguistically able, but not trauma informed, not like completely judgmental of our clients. And, like we could throw classism in there. If someone is able to speak English and their language well, then they must have have access to certain things. And it's sort of like, why is that person as an interpreter more able to find a way here that is legitimate, while the person in front of you, that potential victim, hasn't? And so that is another kind of dynamic to be aware of when you're working with interpreters as well.
Yeah, and I think one thing I forgot to mention as well is sometimes interpreters are from the community. And so added layer of people being concerned about if the community will hear about um, what has happened to them, or their experience, or their story, or their victimization. That's another added layer to think about in terms of interpretation. So I think there's just multiple things to be aware about, and sometimes those cannot be helped. But I think, just ensuring that we are ideally interpreting only the things that you as a service provider, or you as a lawyer, or you as the person who's assisting with this case would be saying. And if you feel that they are going off script, I think it's perfectly fine to kind of stop and remind the interpreter, like, this is, this here is just a direct interpretation, and kind of make that little distinction to help remind them if needed.
I see
And
in,
that actually,
I was
Go
going
ahead.
to answer Priscilla's question really quickly, if that was what you were going to go for.
Yep.
Cool. So I really wish that there was like a one-liner that I could say to like shut people down, but unfortunately, we're presenting this to you in a 3-part series. So obviously it's not easy to just say, hey, like this person is coming from a lot, like there's a lot going on for this individual in front of you, whether they're lying or not, to be able to tell you, the deepest, darkest thing that they may have experienced, or, and so I think to encourage the person to be a bit more trauma informed. And, if the person is serving as a translator, they probably don't have, oftentimes the translators we're working with don't have all that trauma informed background of like how to work with someone who's experienced violence and who's experienced all those different forms of oppression and victimization that makes a person kind of shut down and very guarded, to be able to reveal some of these details. And we didn't spend too much time talking about shame, but many of the Asian cultures are very much more shame oriented as opposed to guilt oriented. So just saying that I have this sense of shame is not, I have no way to explain it to you, but let's just say it weighs much more heavily on a person than just to say, I feel bad about what I did. It's more like, I've done some deep, dark sin, and like, I cannot tell this to anybody. And so that is a reason why an API client might not answer the question forthrightly in your first meeting. And so for us, we're often taking every opportunity to offer services, but also then build a relationship with the person so that they can trust that we're out there looking out for them, wanting to give them opportunities, or getting them connected to things that they don't otherwise have access to. And hopefully with that trust building, they can then start to share some of these details with you and with your colleagues.
Yeah, and I mentioned that people are very practically oriented, but I keep saying there's so many layers. So that people are very practically oriented, but I think also people feel that they do not deserve the services that you are providing. So another thing is, if I offer, like, if there's something that there's gift cards, we have gift cards. Gift cards are a good example. So we often get donations of gift cards. If I offer them a lot of times to my clients who are API, they often feel that they do not deserve it, and that they should be giving this, or they would be taking away from someone who needs it more. And I think the needing it more kind of thing has to go with the self-sufficiency we talked about. It has to talk about the burdening that we talked about. And so I think but I think it's important to kind of think about what practical needs can we think about and how we frame those things. So even saying, well, actually, like, this gift cards were already given to other people, and this one's specifically allocated to you, and this is for you. So even thinking about that, I know the question was also kind of around how people have been frustrated that clients are not, I guess, frustrated that they don't automatically reveal they were trafficked or engaged in the sex trade. I would position that question to really reframe how we're approaching this, because I think part of it is also challenging myself and my other colleagues, but really positioning yourself like, why should they trust me? They don't know me. Like, I can say all the things I want to say, but if we're looking at exploiters and traffickers, they also have said all of the same things I have for, I'm here to help you and I want to provide you services and or I'm here to support you in the community. So I think that's kind of a good way to reframe that in terms of thinking about, well, I mean, if people have been misled and exploited and trafficked in so many ways and times, then why should they automatically trust whatever I tell them? So I think that's kind of a good way. And that's, I think, really thinking about kind of being trauma informed and also think about the cultural aspects of it. But that's what I would kind of challenge for people who are really frustrated. And I completely understand being frustrated. And I think that's such a natural part of this process. And we take time and we take time to collaborate and we take time to really understand that. But I think framing it as like, why should people trust me? And I need to earn their trust because their trust has been broken so many times. So.
Thank you. That was a really insightful answer to that question. And your answers really made me think that, my hope is that for organizations that are watching that work with translators, that they'll invite the translators to our next session, because that really will give them that background on how to be trauma informed and how to practice non-judgment and meet people where they are, and what it means to be a good translator in this space, and just provide a lot more background on trafficking in the API community, how we can serve the API community in a trauma-informed way. So for those, anybody, really anybody working in the space, but certainly, that's one group that maybe reach out and invite them, because I think they would really benefit from that next deep dive that we're going to take. So with that, I am so grateful to both of you. I continue to learn and improve my skills as an advocate for our clients, from learning from both of you. So thank you for all the time that you both have put into this training and to working on these issues and developing your expertise in this area. You are absolutely experts in this space, and I'm very grateful to know you and have the pleasure of working with you. So, I think I was just concluding, and I see a few more questions popping up. Oh, yay. People are saying that they're inviting one person said they invited their translator to this webinar. So that's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. So thank you all so much. I really look forward to the next few trainings. I hope to see you all there. And just thank you again to Amy and Yvonne and to your organizations for partnering with us on this training series.
Thank you so much.
Enjoy the rest of your day. And
Thanks,
hope everybody is safe from the snow and all the crazy weather everywhere. Take care of yourselves, everybody. Be safe. And we'll see you next time.
Yeah.